For the last 2 days, I have been stuck on Psalm 69. I read it Sunday morning before church, Monday morning again, and I have been praying Psalm 69, meditating on Psalm 69, reading over and over. And this morning I started seeing this as a picture of leadership, the three realities of leadership that we face constantly. I want to just read a few verses, actually the last three verses as our text today. Psalm 69, 34, 35, and 36. Let heaven and earth praise him, the seas and everything that moves in them. For God will save Zion and build up the cities of Judah, and people will dwell there and possess it. The offspring of his servants shall inherit it, and those who love his name shall dwell in it. Now, these three verses, it says God will bring this great deliverance. God will save. God will build. Specifically, God will save Zion and build up the cities. And then all these people praise and they're dwelling there, and it's like the purpose of God. And if only that were the whole psalm. Just these three verses. These three verses of victory, these three verses of hope, these three verses of solution, these three verses of deliverance. That would be my favorite psalm. But that's not the whole psalm. There are 33 other verses that aren't quite so victorious, and they're not quite so happy, and they are the verses, these 33 verses create the circumstance where God steps in and saves and builds up. These other 33 verses create the circumstance that brings this great divine deliverance, this salvation. And I wish we could all of life would be these last three verses where everything is great and summed up and God came through. But the fact is, most of life and most of leadership is the first 33 verses. And here's what it looks like. Verses 1 through 29, it explains what I call complex circumstances or complicated circumstances. When I think about the complexity of this, all of the things, these 29 verses, about all that can go wrong in leadership, about all the difficulties of leadership. I think about Dr. Richard Lovelace, who wrote one of the best books on spiritual renewal, spiritual theology that you'll ever read, The Dynamics of Spiritual Life. He talked in that book about complex sin and complicated sin. And my friend, Dr. Greg Okeson, one of my professors at Asbury, in his book, A Public Missiology, he talked about the same idea, this complexity of sin and complicated sin. And he talked about that needing a thick gospel. But the problem is sometimes we bring a thin gospel to a complex problem. But a complex problem needs a thick gospel. So when I read this, I think about that. So we have this idea of verses 1 through 29, what I labeled as complex circumstances. And as leaders, we all face those. I'll go back to those in a moment. Then in 4 verses, in verse 30 through 33, we have difficult decisions. We'll look at that decision in just a moment. These difficult decisions, because of complex circumstances, leaders have difficult decisions to make. And then it ends with verses 34 through 36 that we read. And that's this divine deliverance. And again, I would love to live all of life in this divine salvation and divine deliverance and the faithfulness of God. But the fact is, we live much of our leadership life dealing with the complexities of sin, complex circumstances, and then making difficult decisions the best we can in the midst of that. Then we see the divine deliverance. Even if we don't make the right decision or the best decision, we don't always make the best or right decision, but God does always come through because He is the divine deliverer. He is the one who brings salvation. Now, let's break this down. Verses 1 through 3, in the Message, it says this. It uses this phrase, I am in over my head. That's kind of Eugene Peterson's summary of this idea. I'm in over my head. That's the phrase in the Message. I am in over my head. Every leader watching this video or listening to this, just the audio, we've all felt like we're in over our heads. But this idea of I am, there are four I ams in verses 1 through 29. Here they are. This is the complexity that he's saying. Verse 3, I am weary. Verse 12, I am the talk of those who sit at the gate, and the drunkards make songs about me. Or the NIV says, mock. I am mocked. So I am weary. And what he's weary of in verse 3 is crying out to God and praying and hoping and believing for God to come through to a point of weariness. So I am weary. I am mocked. And then it goes on to verse 17. I am in distress. There's a difference in stress and being in distress. Stress sometimes can be healthy. And when we put our muscles through stress, it creates stronger muscles. There are emotional stress that can, when we react properly, that can make us stronger humans instead of weaker. But distress is when we respond poorly to stress. Stress can be positive or negative. Stress can be helpful or hurtful. But distress means we're in a bad emotional state because of the stress. And so this guy's not just facing stress, he's distressed because of the circumstance. So he says this, I am weary, I am mocked, I am distressed. And then in verse 29, I am afflicted and in pain. Okay, that's the life of the leader. That's leadership. Verses 1 through 29, 29 verses of weariness, being mocked, being distressed, being afflicted, and in pain. All right? Complex circumstances, difficult situations. Then what happens is this. The next section of this psalm, from 29 verses, now the next 4 verses, I call these the I will. We go from I am to I will. And here's the psalmist's response to the complex circumstance that he's in, that includes mockery and weariness and distress and affliction and pain. Verse 30, this is the difficult decision. One of the most difficult decisions you'll ever make as a leader. The difficult decisions aren't about budgets and numbers on the budgets with a lot of zeros. Those are easy decisions. They're not about personnel. Here's the difficult decision. It's going to seem ridiculously simple, but it is tough. When your circumstances, verse 1 through 29, look what he says. Verse 30, I will praise the name of God. That's a decision. That's a tough decision. That's a difficult decision. Then after that, he says, I will magnify him with thanksgiving. In the midst of weariness, in the midst of affliction, in the midst of pain, in the midst of distress, in the midst of all of this, will you thank God? As a leader, here's the decision. I will praise him with a song. I will magnify him with thanksgiving. Magnify means you make something bigger. When you get a magnifying glass and you look at these scriptures. Okay, this is just the acceptable font for me. Some Bibles, it's so small, I can't read it. I have to get a magnifying glass and it will make it look larger and bigger. And so in the midst of difficult distress, all these bad things of verses 1 through 29, there's a decision to make. Will I magnify the problem? Will I magnify my pain? Will I magnify my weariness? Will I magnify my circumstance? Or will I magnify God? And when I magnify God, everything else seems smaller. When I magnify my circumstances and my affliction and my pain and all of these things, then God seems smaller. What will you magnify? This is a decision. I will. I am all of this. I am experiencing difficult situations, but I will praise his name in song. I will magnify God. Difficult decisions. As a leader, we make all kinds of difficult decisions, none more difficult than choosing and deciding to magnify God in tough, painful, unjust, impossible situations. I will praise his name. I will magnify him with thanksgiving. And then we get to this end part. So we have one section is the I am section. My circumstance. I am in this situation. 29 verses. Then we have the next section, 4 verses. I will make these decisions. And then we have the last 3 verses are the victory. It just says, God will save. God will build up. Takes a while to get there. But that's our ultimate inevitable reality. But as leaders, we go through the rest of it. I'm so glad that in Psalms, it's not just, songs about the last 3 verses where everything turns out great and everything turns out wonderfully. But I'm glad that David gave us songs to sing that go through the difficulties of life. It's not just the happy, clappy, everything's wonderful all the time, but he goes through the tough situations of life and ends with God. So as leaders, let's not pretend like Everything is always these last 3 verses. There's a journey to get there. There are complex circumstances that lead to difficult decisions, but ultimately the end is our divine deliverance from God. So I'm trusting God with you to show up, and it says here, He saves and He builds up. So may God save you in whatever circumstance you're in. You're over your head, may God save you, and may He build you up as a leader.